remedy that our enemies have chosen, and I say, let us give them all they want. In September of 1861, the 26th North Carolina was formed near Raleigh, North Carolina, and in the fall was stationed in defense of the town of New Bern. Colonel Zebulon Vance was assigned as the commander. Vance was not a professional soldier, and in the future, as the listener will realize, he was more suited as a politician. But still, he was not ignorant of the needs of his troops and relied upon good officers to prepare them for battle. As the first year of the war dragged on, Vance watched helplessly as Burnside advanced through eastern North Carolina with very little opposition. He knew it was only a matter of time before Burnside would turn his attention to the important intercoastal city and trade center of New Bern. Vance understood the importance of New Bern to the Confederacy. The Confederate blockade runners would travel to the port city of Beaufort or Atlantic City, drop their goods onto the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad, and then these goods would travel to the railroad junction at New Bern. They continued onto the Great Railroad Junction at Goldsboro and then finally northward, where they supplied the Army of Northern Virginia. The New Bern garrison was one of the last two remaining major fortifications that protected this all-important Atlantic North Carolina Railway. Vance was determined to hold it, and he listened to his subordinates, who saw problems with the defense of the city. These problems were the troops were undisciplined and undertrained. Defensive fortifications were poorly laid out, and they simply did not have enough men to hold off a determined effort by the Yankees. The loss of the Mosquito fleet did not help matters. In January of 1862, a new commander was appointed to take over the forces at New Bern. His name was Lawrence O'Brien Branch, or LOB Branch for short. Branch was a private in September of 1861, but rose quickly to become a brigadier general just before he took command of the Army of New Bern in January 1862. Branch was also a political appointment, not a career military officer. Nevertheless, Branch did seem to have some common sense in regards to military matters. He did try to fix some of the problems that the forces of New Bern had. That force consisted of just 4,000 men. To make matters worse, sickness was common in the New Bern Army. Branch asked the locals if they could spare some laborers, meaning slaves, to correct and finish some of the fortifications. The locals grudgingly supplied a few slaves to update the defenses, which was far short of what Branch asked for. This situation forced Branch to use his own men to do most of the digging with whatever scarce tools they could find. At this time, Branch sent repeated requests to the Confederate administration in Richmond for more men in cannon, which, as with Roanoke Island, were promptly ignored. Despite all this, morale was high with the rebel soldiers, and many boasts on how only one rebel could lick 5 Yankees in a fight were heard. The fight for New Bern was close, and the battleground was best 10 miles south of the city, so he deployed his troops there and prepared for Burnside's approach. On the other side of the Pamlico Sound, General Burnside had finished fortifying and consolidating his victories, and was now ready to move on to another prize, New Bern. He loaded his 11,000 troops onto transports and set off on March 11th for his next objective. Admiral Goldsboro had been called away to Norfolk because of the threat of the ironclad Virginia. So he left his tactical commander, Stephen Rowan, in charge of the Union fleet. Burnside had no weather problems this time, as his small naval force moved across the Pamlico Sound on a beautiful, calm day, and on the night of March 12th anchored quietly at Slocum Creek, just 17 miles south of New Bern. The next day the troops and howitzers came ashore, and they began their march toward New Bern. On that same day, the rain started, and it kept raining, turning the road to a muddy and mucus-like state. The troops slogged through a sticky mud that clung to their ankles and made a 7-mile march seem like 70. Commander Rowan provided good artillery support as he kept his Union gunboats slightly ahead of the slogging troops as he blasted anything that may have been hiding in front of them. The Confederate scouts watched from a distance as the Union troops moved. Signal fires were lit as word was sent back to Branch that the Yankees were marching by the land route to New Bern. Finally, at the end of the day on the 14th, the Yankees approached the first rebel Croatan fortifications, which were deserted, and they settled down in the rain for a long, wet, chilly night. That morning, the fog hung in the air as the Union troops ready for battle. They had a few problems, one being the rain had dampened everyone's gunpowder, and some of the troops that were equipped with Enfield rifles, the stocks had swollen in the rain, and the ramrods could not be removed from the rifle barrels. So no reloading could be accomplished. Hundreds of Union men went into battle with only fixed bayonets this day. Branch was preparing his troops for battle. Things were laid out like this for Branch. His left flank was protected by the Neuse River, and the right flank and in front he was protected by broken ground and swamp. Add in addition Bryce's Creek, which was deep water because of all the rain. Seemed like a good position, except for one small problem. The center of his defensive line was broken where a brick kiln intersected the railroad line. For whatever reason, Branch did not recognize the danger until too late. And to compound the problem, a Green Militia regiment was assigned the task of filling this hole in the line. That center breach was a major flaw in his defenses. During the battle, the Union would recognize this error and exploit this breach to its advantage. Burnside's plan was similar to Roanoke Island, in that his troops would move down the center called the Old Beaufort Road, while Foster would hit the rebels on the right side, and General Reno would hit them on the left side. General Parke would be held in reserve in the center. Surprisingly, Burnside himself was almost the first casualty of the battle as he and his aides rode up to within 350 yards of the front lines. They were spotted through the fog and a Confederate cannon opened fire. The shell landed nearby. The battle soon erupted after this first volley. Foster attacked the right side first and found heavy fire from Fort Thompson, along with the rest of the rebels along the line. The firing was so intense that Foster's 23rd Massachusetts took many casualties, causing it to break and fall back. It was then replaced by the 10th Connecticut. The rebels held firm and Foster's attack was ground to a standstill. All the while, Commander Rowan lobbed artillery shells all over the battlefield and kept the heads of the rebels down, and the Yankees too. General Reno began the attack on the left side. Reno seemed to know exactly where to attack because his fire was concentrated on the brick kiln and the Green Militia unit stationed there. There seems to be some unsubstantiated information that Reno knew all the dispositions of Branch's rebel line, explaining why he knew where to concentrate most of his fire. It could also be that Reno correctly gauged the situation and directed his troops accordingly. The Confederates tried to bring up two 24-pound cannon to plug the hole, but Reno again directed Lieutenant Colonel William Clark of the 21st Massachusetts to capture the guns before they could be set up. This Clark did, as now his troops were in the center of the action. Reno correctly saw what was happening and directed more fire on the Green Militia unit, which after a few more volleys broke and ran. The center was now exposed to all as Reno tried to push his men through the gap, and the 35th North Carolina began to sag backwards in the face of increased pressure from the Yanks. Branch immediately saw his error and ordered Gaston Lewis, who was in command of the New Bern Reserve, to move forward to try and again plug the hole in the line. The battle for the brick kiln went back and forth as the troops fought for control of the center. Colonel Clark had been carrying the fight for the center alone, so Reno believed he had to pull him out. He found his replacement in Colonel Isaac Rodman of the 4th Rhode Island. Rodman's men had been in the rear the entire battle and were itching for a fight. Once he learned of the plan, Rodman sent this message to General Parke that he was ready, but did not wait for a reply to begin his attack. He led his men slowly at first, then it became a steady jog toward the center, yelling as Rodman charged the rebel center. Parke, seeing what was happening, immediately ordered several nearby units to join the attack. The rebel center finally buckled under the renewed attack and it fell backwards. The other nearby Confederate regiments also began to drift backwards as the Union soldiers pushed into the gap. Foster also saw the center crumbling and ordered his troops to renew their push all along the rebel line. The breach was opening wider as the Union troops gained ground. Branch began to see the battle becoming hopeless. He had no choice but to order a general retreat to New Bern. Word of the retreat did not get to Colonel Baird Vance on the right side. Vance's men continued their fire, but the pressure from both Reno and Foster's men was too much. Vance had to retreat, but with Branch's left flank already gone and the Yankees already in control of the old Beaufort Road, it was now too late to follow Branch. Vance was forced to retreat to the west over Bryce Creek, which was swollen from the rain. The drowning of 3 men created chaos at the creek crossing. Time was running out as the Union Army was approaching. Vance knew he had to make something happen, so he took his horse and tried the crossing himself, and he too almost drowned. Luckily, he was close enough that some men grabbed him before succumbing to the drowning. Some small boats were found and they became a miniature ferry service for the retreating troops across Bryce Creek. Vance's men made it just before the Union Army reached the creek. The rest of Burnside's army chased the remnants of Branch's Confederate forces through New Bern. He entered the town victorious. The battle was over and Burnside had another victory. He now had the means to destroy the railroad junction at Goldsboro. But like many of the early Union commanders, Burnside chose to pause and consolidate instead of following up and finishing off the retreating and demoralized Confederate forces. The consequences of this lack of action would mean that the war would drag on for 3 more bloody years. Losses were relatively light. The South lost 64 men and 89 wounded, but this time the Union losses were a little higher, 88 men killed and 370 wounded. But the result was the same. The Confederates had lost another important coastal city, and on March 14th, Burnside's troops began to occupy the now almost deserted town of New Bern. Branch and his retreating troops found a new home in the town of Kinston. The remains of the haggard Confederate defenders filtered into Kinston over the next couple of days. Vance's troops, on the other hand, had located a keg of brandy and were in good spirits as they entered the town. The political fallout of this defeat was now being felt by those Confederate commanders who failed to halt the Yankee advance. In Goldsboro, General Richard Gatlin, the overall commander of the North Carolina Theater, was reported to be sick in bed the day of the attack, and this led to the inevitable conclusion that he was fall-down drunk, with which there was no basis in fact. Someone had to be blamed for the fiasco at New Bern, and Gatlin was selected. He was relieved of command shortly afterwards. His final report stated, "We failed to make timely efforts to maintain the ascendancy on Pamlico Sound, and thus admitted Burnside's fleet without a contest. We failed to put a proper force on Roanoke Island, and thus lost the key to our interior coast. And we failed to furnish General Branch with a reasonable force, and thus lost the important town of New Bern. What I claim is that these failures do not by right rest with me." General Branch was not included in those that were blamed. It was said that he did not have enough men to adequately defend New Bern, being outmanned almost 3-1. The fact that he failed to recognize a glaring error in his defenses was not mentioned. As for Zebulon Vance, his reputation was glorified by the state's newspapers, especially when he began his run for the office of governor. In fact, one could say his political popularity benefited greatly from the battle. At this moment, Burnside had North Carolina by the throat and could have pushed inland if McClellan and Lincoln had granted him just a few more men and supplies. The entire coastal plain all the way to Raleigh was there for the taking, with only 3,000 demoralized Confederate soldiers in Kinston to stop him. It can now be said that Burnside made his first tactical mistake. He decided to consolidate his victories and capture all the outlying strong points the Confederates had left. The examples of this was the push for Fort Macon and the canals of South Mills. These conservative decisions would give the rebels time to reinforce the central part of the state and to protect the all-important railroad lines running through it. By the time March and early April had ended, Richmond will have poured 20,000 additional troops into and around Kinston and Goldsboro. By the time Burnside captures Fort Macon, the opportunity for an easy victory in eastern North Carolina and the Civil War would be over. In the first action after New Bern, Burnside detached a contingent of troops southward to capture the town of Beaufort. At the same time, he had heard unsubstantiated reports of rebel ironclads moving into the Albemarle Sound from Currituck. Rowan's gunboats could not stand up to any ironclad, so he detached Reno's command, about 3,000 men, to destroy the Culpeper locks in order to stop any ships or ironclads moving southward. This began the Battle of South Mills. The small force of raiders reached the Pasquotank River on April 18th and landed south of Elizabeth City. Being this close to Virginia, Reno knew that even though Elizabeth City was a captured town, it would not take long for the rebels to send troops against him once they knew he was there. So a sense of urgency was all important for his success. He must get in and get out. The first bad omen in his plan was one of the transports was delayed as it ran aground, and after waiting until 3 a.m., Reno finally sent Hawkins and the landed force onto South Mills. Colonel Hawkins managed to find a mulatto man that became his guide to South Mills. Unfortunately for Hawkins, this man either was not as knowledgeable of the area as he claimed, or had other ideas, and led his forces down the wrong road. It was not long before the Confederate cavalry picket discovered his forces and galloped off to sound the alarm. The element of surprise was now gone, and the mulatto man tried to escape, but Hawkins caught him and had him shot. This detour cost the raiders valuable time that the Southerners used to full advantage and began moving troops toward South Mills. Hawkins was now forced to push his troops an extra 10 miles all night to their objective, which meant they would be exhausted by the time the battle even began. In the meantime, General Reno got the rest of his deployed troops landed and joined Hawkins on the final leg of the march. At South Mills, Colonel Ambrose Wright and his 400-strong 3rd Regimental Georgians were preparing for the approaching Northerners. Wright began setting up his forces just south of the locks. As any tactician knows, picking the best ground to fight is all important to victory, and Wright correctly deployed his troops to take maximum advantage. Wright chose the best area for his troops to dig in, about 3 miles south of South Mills, and at the edge of the clearing. Wright had woods on either side and a long field in front of him. Also, there was an irrigation ditch about 300 yards in front of his line. Wright knew this was the only cover the Yankees would find as they advanced, so he ordered his troops to tear down a nearby wooden fence and pile all the debris in that ditch and set it afire. He had turned an advantage into a disadvantage for the Yankees. Late in the morning, the first of Reno's advanced troops entered the battlefield. Wright's cannons opened up from long range. Reno also reasoned that a frontal assault would be pointless and costly to his men, so he ordered his troops into the side flanking tree line to move to the right of the rebels. The 6th New Hampshire and Hawkins' 89th New York also arrived and moved to the center and set up the small howitzers Reno had brought with him. They opened up a steady fire on Wright's undermanned left side. Reno's 51st Pennsylvania, now in the woods on the right side, had been marching all night and at a fast pace. They could go no further because of exhaustion and stopped once they were in the trees. The one opportunity for the North came as Wright's commander on the left side, W.W. McComas, was moving to protect the left side of the line when he was hit and killed by gunfire. Wright's men on the left side now began to panic as they were leaderless and under fire. Wright personally moved to them and shored up their courage and got his 2 cannons firing. Hawkins believed the rebels were falling back due to the slackened fire, so against his commander's orders, he charged down the center with Zouaves. When they reached the burning ditch, Wright's men opened up and 9 of Hawkins' men fell dead, plus 58 wounded, including Hawkins. This would be the last and only push the Yankees would make, and they quickly fell back to their original position. On the other side, Colonel Wright, not knowing the Union troops' true condition, was getting low on ammo and it was getting late in the afternoon. So he redeployed his troops northward and closer to the locks in order to protect them. Reno's exhausted men were in no shape to continue the battle and were getting no closer to the Culpeper locks, so it was decided to retreat back to the ships after a short rest. Reno also figured the Confederacy would be sending more reinforcements to this area the longer they remained. The Battle of South Mills was over, and for the first time the rebels had repulsed a Yankee advance in eastern North Carolina. Reno suffered 13 killed and 101 wounded, while Wright lost 6 men and 20 wounded. It was an unnecessary engagement for Burnside. There was no ironclad coming down the Pasquotank River to attack his small gunboats. It was this rumor that gave the Confederates their first victory, and even worse, it wasted the time Burnside needed for an advance upon Goldsboro. In retrospect, Burnside's strategic thinking was slow and methodical, which was foreshadowing of his command and defeat at Fredericksburg. He was overly concerned about his supply lines, thus his fixation on Beaufort and Fort Macon. He believed if he could take the town and its aging fort, he would have a direct supply line by rail from the sea. So it was decided that Fort Macon would be his next target. I cannot say enough what a tactical mistake this was. If Burnside had marched on Goldsboro immediately after his victory and destroyed the railroad junction and what was left of the Southern forces, he could have done great harm to the armies of Northern Virginia. Lee's supply line would have been reduced by roughly half, perhaps more. There was also the better option of taking out the port of Wilmington. At this point in the war, Wilmington was lightly defended with little or no fortifications. It was a nice ripe target for any Union commander with an ounce of strategic vision. If Wilmington were taken, the city of Beaufort and Fort Macon would have been cut off from any supplies, being located behind enemy lines. Burnside to the west and the powerful Union fleet to the east. The Union could have taken its time and taken out the withering vine that was Fort Macon at their leisure. Also, with Wilmington gone, every port of significance in North Carolina would have been neutralized, and the blockade runners would have been forced to look elsewhere for safe harbor. Supplies would have taken days longer to reach General Lee in Virginia. But good strategy early in the war was not the North's strength, the one exception being the invasion of North Carolina's coast. Given time, the Confederacy built upon the Wilmington defenses, and it wasn't until the end of the war when it was finally taken at great cost to both sides. The die was cast, and Burnside began preparing his invasion of Beaufort and Fort Macon. Burnside selected a trusted subordinate in General John G. Parke for the task. Parke understood that to take Fort Macon he needed howitzers, not columbiads or other horizontally firing cannon, and he made his preparations accordingly. He loaded up his 4 10-inch siege mortars, 8-inch mortars, and a couple of 30-pound Parrott guns and headed for Beaufort. On March 23rd, Parke camped at Carolina City. He would attack the fort from the land side of Bogue Banks. Parke was hoping that the commander of the fort would see the hopelessness of the situation and save his men by surrendering to the numerically superior Union force. The fort would be taken either way. At Fort Macon, a 27-year-old colonel, Moses J. White, was in command. Moses had no intention of surrendering. To defend the fort, White was given a garrison of 22 officers and 419 men. Moses was relatively inexperienced as a commander, but knew his way around ordnance and cannon. On the hardware side, he had 7 formidable columbiads, 19 24-pounders, 24 32-pound cannon, 6 field cannon, plus 35,000 pounds of gunpowder, which would last about 3 days. All these weapons were designed to defend against a sea invasion, and they were all fired horizontally. Parke would attack from the land side of Bogue Banks. Moses' options were few, but he would fight and could only hope that the enemy would be unfortunate enough to storm the fort so his cannon could be brought to bear. Parke was not that inept and would act as any sane officer would have done, and bombard the fort with mortars from a safe distance until they could take no more. On March 18th, White sent a detachment of men ashore to burn the Beaufort Railroad Bridge to slow down Parke. On the 23rd, which is about the same time frame as the South Mills raid, Parks arrived at the small village of Carolina City with the 4th Rhode Island and the 8th Connecticut. In his first act, Parks sent this message to Colonel Moses. "Sir, in order to save the unnecessary effusion of blood, I have the honor to demand the evacuation of the fort and the surrender of the forces under your command. Having an intimate knowledge of the entire work and an overwhelming force at our command, with the means for reducing the work, its fall is inevitable. On condition that no damage be done to the fortification or armament, your command will be released as prisoners of war on parole. Very respectfully yours, General G. Parke." Colonel White had a response for Parke. "Your request is received, and I have the honor to decline." There would be no peaceful surrender this time, and Parke began to prepare for a siege. He occupied Atlantic City and Beaufort to cut off any supplies that still may be running to Fort Macon. He also repaired the burned railroad bridge over the Newport River. Parke decided to land his men and cannon 4 miles west of Fort Macon. On March 29th, his men loaded up on boats and rafts and began to make their way to the landing site. Floating the 2-ton Parrott guns to Bogue Banks was no easy task, along with the 930-pound siege mortars. By April 11th, everything was ashore, and Parke decided to send a large reconnaissance patrol toward the fort to find a suitable siege location for his mortars. They set up 1,300 yards from the fort. Parke also set up defensive infantry lines just 2,000 feet from the fort to dissuade the Confederates from counterattacking. Of course, the mortars were set up behind large sand dunes to allow them to fire unmolested at the fort. The cannon were set up as follows: the 8-inch mortars 1,280 yards from the fort. Then came the Parrott guns 200 yards further back. Then came the third line of 10-inch mortars, a rather impressive array of artillery. White knew what was going on and tried to improvise a few of his 32-pound cannon by raising them up and elevating the barrels in the hope he could turn them into mortars. This proved to be almost impossible since these cannon were never designed to do this type of shooting. All the while, Parke was preparing for the siege, which included setting up signal corps stations to assist in guiding his cannon fire. White must have realized he had to take a chance and try to attack the Union fortifications, perhaps in the miracle he could surprise them and drive them off. On the night of April 20th, he sent 2 companies of Confederates to attack the Union infantry lines. This desperate attempt at an attack was quickly driven back, with almost no casualties except a Union leg wound and an accidental self-inflicted shot in the arm by one of the Rhode Island men. This was the last of White's attacks on the entrenched Yankees. At some point, Burnside himself had arrived in Carolina City, and on April 24th, Burnside wanted to meet with Colonel White in one last attempt to convince him of the hopelessness of his situation. White was not going to change his mind. He had decided to resist no matter the cost. The next morning, the Union cannon began the bombardment. To make matters worse, on the day of the bombardment, the Confederates only had 263 men fit for duty. The rest were sick with fever and other maladies. As the Union opened up, the rebels returned fire with everything they had, but as predicted, the Union troops were well protected behind the sand dune fortifications. At the same time, 4 Union gunboats approached the fort from the sea and added the cannon to Parke's land bombardment. Now the fort could finally retaliate against the Union attack and opened up with their 8-inch Columbiad. The first well-aimed shells slammed into the U.S. Daylight's engine room. Next, the USS Gemsbrook had a mast blasted to splinters. After 2 of the Union ships had taken damage in rough seas, the Union squadron withdrew. and the rebels were heard to burst out into cheers as they watched the Yankees retire out of range. Parke's land cannon had not yet found the range to the fort, but with a signal corps, it was not long before the Union shells began a steady rain of lead and steel. The Union cannon slowly battered the fort, and the casualties began to climb on the Confederate side. The fort began to lose cannon as they were struck and disabled. In mid-afternoon, White ordered an all-out effort by his remaining cannon to fire everything as fast as they could at the Yankees. Maybe they could get a lucky shot and take out a few of those mortars. They did manage to damage one of Parke's Parrott guns and wound a couple men, but after a few minutes the gun was back in operation, pounding the fort. In a major cause for concern, the Union Parrott guns had begun to open a crack in the wall protecting the fort's gunpowder magazine. If this continued and a shell penetrated the magazine, there would be a massive explosion, killing many of White's men and rendering the fort helpless. At 4:30 p.m., White decided he had resisted enough, and he ran up the white flag of surrender. Burnside drew up some generous surrender terms for White and his men. They would be paroled and allowed to leave with their belongings. Thus ended the Battle of Fort Macon. Casualties were surprisingly light on both sides. White lost 7 men and 18 wounded. Parke lost 1 man and 2 wounded. The next day, Burnside held a victory parade through the streets of New Bern. As far as he was concerned, his main tasks were accomplished. Against an unprepared and delusional Confederate administration, Burnside had captured almost the entire coast of North Carolina with very light casualties. With the exception of Wilmington, Burnside was hailed as a hero by the Northern press, as well as being loved by his men. He now was ready to move on to Goldsboro to finally cut Lee's main supply artery. What he did not realize was that he was about to be told that his supply lines would be choked off to a trickle by General McClellan. McClellan had tamped down expectations in his original plans for Burnside. The original brilliant strategic idea to cut out Lee's supply lines would be changed to raiding and destroying the railroad lines at Goldsboro. Then a hasty retreat back to fortified New Bern. This was all so McClellan could pursue his poorly executed Peninsular campaign in Virginia. Thus ended all main offensive operations in eastern North Carolina, with the exception being the final invasion of Wilmington in 1865. Burnside would continue his exploratory raids upon Kinston and Goldsboro, but the Burnside expedition would never again venture out in force to capture any North Carolina territory. For the next 3 years, defense, raids, and 2 failed Confederate attempts to take back New Bern would be the best description of all activity. Till Lee's last day at Appomattox, he would have to look over his shoulder to eastern North Carolina to evaluate the condition of his supply line before he began any offensive operations. And Lincoln would never realize how close he came to bringing the war to a swift end.